In 1892, beneath the deep blue skies of the Arizona Territory, amid the chaos, Chenoa, a 20-year-old Apache woman, knelt on the hard, dry ground, with both hands covering her tear-streaked face. Her dark blue traditional dress, decorated with tribal patterns, was now wrinkled and covered in dust. Her father, an Apache man ruined by alcohol, stood nearby in a drunken haze, while her cruel mother gripped her daughter's arm tightly and shoved her forward as if she were merchandise. $100. Just $100, and you can take the girl and do whatever you want with her. Her mother snarled, her eyes cold and merciless. The crowd murmured uneasily. Some cowboys shook their heads in sympathy, while a few other Apache people lowered their eyes, unable to bear the sight. Chenoa trembled as tears streamed down her cheeks. She had never imagined that her own family would sell her simply to pay off a gambling debt. Suddenly, a tall figure stepped through the crowd. Ryder Kane, the solitary rancher of Shadow Creek Valley, emerged from the gathering. His rough cotton shirt was faded from years of sun and wind. A revolver hung low at his side, and the brim of his cowboy hat shadowed his deep-set eyes. He was not a man of many words. He never had been. But today, his voice rang out clearly, deep and steady like distant thunder. "She's mine." Every dollar he had saved throughout the entire cattle season, earned one coin at a time, was placed firmly into the drunken father's hand. The money pouch clinked heavily. The crowd fell silent. Chenoa's mother stared in shock for a moment before quickly snatching the money and dragging her husband away without a single word of farewell. Chenoa lifted her head, her large brown eyes filled with fear and disbelief as she looked at the stranger who had just purchased her freedom. Ryder extended his hand. He did not touch her. He simply gestured gently. "There is no need to be afraid," he said quietly, his voice low and calm. "You are not a debt anymore." She hesitated for a long moment before finally rising to her feet. Red dust continued to drift around them, while Ryder's Mustang stood quietly nearby, as if it understood the weight of the moment. Around them, townspeople began to whisper, "That Apache girl will never make it with the lonely rancher. Winter is coming. The snow will bury everything." Ryder paid no attention to the gossip. He gently guided Chenoa away from the trading post and toward the small ranch hidden deep within the valley. Along the road, old wooden fences seemed to be waiting for someone to repair them. The first cold winds of the season swept across the land, warning of a harsh winter on the horizon. Chenoa clenched her hands tightly, her heart in turmoil. She had just been rescued from bondage, yet she had also stepped into a loveless marriage with a man she barely knew, a stranger who was quiet, distant, and full of mystery. The trail leading into Shadow Creek Valley was long and quiet. Ryder Kane rode in front, while Chenoa sat behind him on his sturdy brown Mustang. Not a single word passed between them during the journey. There was only the whisper of the wind through the sagebrush and the steady rhythm of hooves striking dirt and stone. When the wooden cabin finally came into view in the middle of the valley, Chenoa caught her breath. The house was small but solid, with a thin stream of smoke drifting from the chimney. An aging wooden fence surrounded the ranch, looking fragile against the cold wind. Ryder stopped the horse, climbed down first, then offered his hand to help her dismount without touching her directly. "You can have the main room," he said quietly, his voice as low and steady as ever. "I will sleep in the woodshed." Chenoa bit her lip and said nothing. She stepped into the cabin with a heavy heart. It was warmer inside than she had expected, but the silence between them felt colder than the wind outside. She curled up on a wooden chair beside the fireplace, hugging her knees tightly. Ryder quietly set down her belongings, then turned and went back outside without asking any questions. The first few days passed with a clear distance between them. Chenoa rarely left her room. She was afraid, suspicious. This man had spent every dollar he owned to buy her freedom. But why? Did he intend to turn her into something else? Each night, she lay awake, listening to the sound of Ryder repairing the fences beneath the moonlight. The next morning, when Chenoa stepped outside, she found him bent over a section of rotting fence, replacing the damaged boards. Sweat soaked through his shirt, revealing the strength of the muscles beneath the rough fabric. Beside him sat an old hunting dog named Shadow, its tail wagging gently. Ryder glanced at her once before sliding the finest cut of fresh venison toward her. "Eat," he said. "Winter is coming." Chenoa accepted it, her voice trembling. "You do not have to do this. I am not really your wife." Ryder simply shrugged and continued repairing the fence. "I did not buy you to be a servant. You are free here." Little by little, his quiet acts of kindness began to fill the empty spaces in Chenoa's heart. He repaired the cabin roof before the first snowfall. Every morning, he left the hottest cup of coffee for her. He never entered her room without knocking first. One afternoon, when Chenoa struggled to wash clothes in the icy stream, Ryder silently brought extra dry firewood without saying a word. From time to time, townspeople stopped by, bringing their gossip with them. "That Apache girl does not look very happy. Do you really think that lonely rancher can keep her around through the winter?" Their whispers only made Chenoa more confused. Then one night, as the wind howled across the valley and the fireplace crackled warmly, Ryder sat in the corner of the room carving a small piece of wood. Chenoa moved a little closer and watched him gently care for Shadow's injured leg. The firelight danced across Ryder's quiet face, and for the first time, she noticed the deep loneliness hidden in his eyes. "How long have you lived alone?" she asked softly. "Many years," Ryder replied without looking up. "This ranch used to be filled with hope. Then one day, it was just me." Chenoa said nothing more, but something stirred quietly inside her heart. The distance between them was still there, but for the first time, it no longer felt cold. Outside, the first snowflakes drifted down onto the old fence, silently witnessing the slow change unfolding within two lonely hearts. "Hey, friend. It's great to see you today. If this story takes you back to the old days, please subscribe to the channel so we can meet again." The days that followed at Shadow Creek Ranch passed like an autumn stream, slow and steady, yet never standing still. Each night, the snow fell more heavily, wrapping the valley in a blanket of pure white. Chenoa gradually began spending more time outside her room. She no longer avoided Ryder the way she once had, though a distance still lingered between them, like the old fence that remained unfinished. One bitterly cold morning, Ryder stood outside by the fence with a hammer and a handful of nails. Strong winds rattled several loose boards. Wearing her thin Apache cloak, Chenoa stepped outside to help him. "Let me try," she said softly, reaching for one of the boards. Ryder looked surprised, but did not stop her. The two worked side by side in silence. At one point, his hand accidentally brushed hers as he passed her a nail. Both of them froze for a brief second, yet neither pulled away. Chenoa felt the warmth of his calloused hand, rough from years of hard work. It felt warmer than the fire burning inside the cabin. "You have repaired this fence many times, have you not?" she asked, her voice gentler than before. "Every winter," Ryder replied, never taking his eyes off the work. "It keeps the wolves away from the cattle, and it keeps me from feeling too alone." They spent the entire morning mending the fence together. When they finished, Ryder quietly set aside the best portion of roasted venison for her lunch. Later, as they sat near the fireplace, Chenoa spoke to him for the first time about Apache traditions, how her people honored the natural world, and how she had always dreamed of having a real home instead of being treated like a burden or a debt. Ryder listened without interrupting. He simply nodded now and then, giving her his full attention. That quiet respect began to melt the walls around Chenoa's heart. On another afternoon, Ryder taught her how to ride a once wild Mustang that he had trained himself. The horse was powerful but gentle around him. Chenoa was nervous at first, but Ryder stayed beside her, patiently guiding her through each step. Not once did he criticize her when she nearly fell. When she finally succeeded and let out a delighted laugh, Ryder smiled. It was a rare smile, one that transformed his face and made him seem years younger. During the long winter evenings, they sat together beside the fire. Ryder carved small wooden figures while Chenoa sewed in the traditional Apache style. Sometimes he shared pieces of his past. His ranch had once been filled with a family, but disease had taken his wife and child, leaving him to face the world alone. In return, Chenoa told him about the pain of being sold by her own family. Their stories were not dramatic. They were simply fragments of ordinary lives marked by loss. Yet each shared memory drew their hearts a little closer together. The townspeople still stopped by from time to time, bringing their usual gossip. That Apache girl looks happier now. But can Ryder really hold on to her through a winter this harsh? Those whispers sometimes filled Chenoa with uncertainty. Yet whenever that happened, Ryder would quietly place another log on the fire or bring her an extra blanket without saying a word. One evening, as snow fell heavily outside, Chenoa watched Ryder caring for old Shadow, whose age was finally beginning to show. The firelight illuminated his face, revealing the exhaustion of another long day of labor. In that moment, she realized something. Ryder had not only bought her freedom with his money, through every silent act of kindness, he was also trying to redeem his own wounded heart. A faint smile touched her lips. For the first time, she reached for his hand on purpose as she offered him a cup of hot coffee. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Ryder looked at her, his deep eyes holding countless unspoken feelings. Outside, the old fence stood firm beneath the falling snow, silently witnessing the slow but certain change taking place between two lonely souls. The distance between them was still there, but it had never felt warmer. That winter showed no mercy to Shadow Creek Valley. Snow fell relentlessly, and the wind howled like a pack of hungry wolves. Ryder's ranch began to show its first signs of strain. One gloomy afternoon, as Chenoa sat sewing beside the fireplace, the sound of galloping horses thundered beyond the fence. Her parents had returned, this time accompanied by several local thugs. Her drunken father shouted loudly, "The girl was not enough. We need more money. You got her for far too cheap, rancher." Chenoa went pale as old fears came rushing back. Trembling, she rose to her feet. Ryder stepped outside, his hand gripping the butt of his revolver. His voice remained low, but there was no mistaking the determination behind it. "She is not property. You took the money. Now leave." The argument quickly escalated. One of the thugs lunged at him. Ryder reacted instantly, knocking the man to the ground, but not before a knife slashed deep across his arm. Bright red blood stained the white snow. Chenoa's parents eventually rode away in anger, but their bitter words lingered in the frozen air. "She will only be a burden to you." That night, the blizzard arrived in full force. Powerful winds tore through the valley, bringing down part of the fence and sending the livestock into a panic. Despite the crude bandage wrapped around his injured arm, Ryder rushed outside to save the horses. Chenoa followed him. Together, they fought against the storm. Then a large tree branch snapped under the weight of ice and crashed into Ryder's shoulder. He collapsed into the snow, unconscious. With tears streaming down her face, Chenoa dragged him back to the cabin. She spent the entire night tending to his injuries, her heart aching with every passing hour. "Why would you sacrifice so much?" she whispered desperately. "I was only a debt you paid for." The next morning, Ryder was still weak. That was when Chenoa made her decision. She packed a few belongings and prepared to leave. "I do not want you to die because of me," she said quietly. Maybe I should go back." But when she stepped outside, the snow was still falling heavily. The old fence they had repaired together now lay shattered beneath the storm. Then she heard his voice. "Chenoa, do not go." Ryder had forced himself outside, despite the pain. Leaning against one of the broken fence posts, he stood waiting for her. They faced each other beside the ruined fence, while snow swirled all around them. The fence that had witnessed every change in their lives now stood as a silent witness once again. Chenoa broke down in tears. "Why are you doing all of this?" she cried. "You lost all your money. You got hurt. The ranch is falling apart. All because of me." His face was pale from pain, but his eyes never wavered. When he spoke, his voice trembled with both exhaustion and emotion. "Not because of the debt. Not because your family sold you. The moment I saw you at that trading post, this lonely ranch finally felt like home again. I do not want you as a burden. I want you as my wife, my partner. You became mine the day I gave you my heart, not the day I paid for your freedom. And if you will have me, I want to spend the rest of my life proving that. Unless you ask me to stop loving you, I never will." Chenoa stood frozen, tears mixed with the falling snow on her cheeks. Every quiet act of kindness came rushing back to her, his patience, his respect, his unwavering care. All the things he had done, without ever asking for anything in return. Without another word, she ran to him and wrapped her arms around him, holding him tightly despite his injuries. "I am staying," she whispered. "I choose you, Ryder Kane." For a long moment, they remained there together beside the broken fence. Snow continued to fall around them. But for the first time, neither of them felt the cold. The conflict was over. The hardships had forged them into something stronger. The ranch might have been damaged by the storm, but their love had been rebuilt into something far more enduring than any fence could ever be. After the night of the great blizzard, Shadow Creek Valley witnessed a gentle transformation. Ryder recovered slowly under Chenoa's patient care. Together, they rebuilt the old fence one board at a time, as though they were rebuilding their lives along with it. When spring finally arrived, the snow melted away, and wildflowers burst into bloom across the valley. One warm afternoon, beside the fireplace that had burned faithfully throughout the winter, Ryder lowered himself onto one knee. In his hand was a simple ring he had forged from old silver. "Chenoa, you chose to stay with me through the storm," he said. "Now, I am asking for the chance to stand beside you for the rest of our lives." Laughing and crying at the same time, Chenoa nodded. "I am yours, Ryder." From this day forward, always, they were married in a simple ceremony at the trading post, surrounded by a handful of close friends and the blessings of townspeople who had once doubted them and now admired them deeply. Chenoa wore a traditional Apache dress blended with the style of a Western bride, while Ryder proudly wore the cleanest shirt he owned. 20 years passed, like a warm and beautiful dream. The old ranch fence now stood taller, and stronger than ever before. Snow once again drifted gently across Shadow Creek Valley, but the wooden cabin was now filled with warmth and the laughter of children. Ryder Kane, his hair touched with silver, still quietly placed the best cut of roasted venison onto his wife's plate. Chenoa, now a strong and graceful woman with faint lines at the corners of her eyes, smiled every time she caught him doing it. Their grandchildren raced across the wooden porch. The old Mustang still grazed peacefully in the pasture. Shadow had long since passed away, but a new generation of dogs carried on his legacy. Each evening, the family gathered around the fireplace. Chenoa shared stories of Apache traditions, while Ryder told tales of the harsh winters that had shaped their lives. One evening, Ryder wrapped an arm around his wife from behind and whispered the same words he had spoken years before. "Our home is still warm." Chenoa turned and kissed his cheek. "Because you taught me how to believe in quiet love." Together they stood beside the old fence, the familiar landmark that had witnessed everything. It had stood there on that dusty day filled with tears and heartbreak. It had stood there through the snowfall and the words, "She's mine." And now it stood beside them in this peaceful chapter of their lives. Their love was never loud, like the storms of the American West. It was patient, like the fire in a hearth, always burning, always warming hearts that had once known loneliness. They taught their children and grandchildren an important lesson. Do not wait until winter becomes unbearable to appreciate the people standing beside you. Treasure the quiet acts of kindness, because those small moments are often the strongest bonds of all. When I look back on Chenoa and Ryder's journey, I cannot help but be moved by the gentle power of a slow-burning love story. This is not a tale of grand declarations or dramatic destiny. It is the story of two wounded people who found each other through simple acts of care, repairing fences, sharing the best meal, and sitting patiently beside a fire during the harsh winters of Arizona. Chenoa, an Apache woman betrayed by her own family, learned how to trust again. Ryder, the lonely rancher, discovered that a true home is built not with money, but with love. Their story reminds us that genuine love rarely arrives with fanfare. Instead, it grows quietly through ordinary days, through respect, patience, and unwavering devotion. What do you think? Have you ever met someone who made you feel safe through nothing more than small, thoughtful actions? Or perhaps you are waiting for a dramatic romance, while happiness is already standing quietly beside you, as steady and dependable as an old ranch fence. This story is also a gentle reminder. Do not allow fear or the pain of the past to steal your chance at building a home and a future with someone you love. Be brave enough to open your heart. The most sincere love is always worth staying for, and it is always worth rebuilding life's broken fences together. Thank you for spending this time with me. Wherever you are in the world, I hope you are safe, protected, and surrounded by kindness. I hope our paths cross again in another story very soon. Until then, take care of yourselves and the people you love. And if you enjoyed this journey through Shadow Creek, please subscribe to the channel and join me for more stories ahead.